Okay, YouTubers. Hi, YouTubers. Gil. So today with this video, I'm going to use this VHS camcorder for this blog or this compare 80s with today thing. On this video, I'm going to talk about medicine or we're going to talk about doctors and things like that. I mean, this is a request by Eric Kennedy. The YouTuber requested this, so I'm gonna go ahead and do this video because it makes sense, I would say, because the 80s or today, medicine and doctors and all the, how we call it, available technology and everything. I have to check technology and or how things changed over the years as far as fighting diseases or things like that. I'm only gonna talk about two basic things that I know off the bat. You guys can chime in on what's different today versus then, and you can chime in because I don't have a lot of experience with medicine during the 80s because I was a young kid and I didn't have issues with health or doctors or I mean, I didn't go to doctors. I didn't need to because I was healthy then, you know. But well, anyway, some of the things that I do know, two things that I could talk about off the bat, how are they different then versus today, is thing number one is cancer. Number two thing I could talk about is AIDS and HIV. They were a little bit different back then in the 80s, during the 80s decade. I do know that, like, some of the first times I heard of cancer, I guess, it was in the early 80s. Like, this was a common term that I always heard whenever I came around to hearing about cancer. A common, what do you call it, term that I would hear, or a common thing that I would always hear after hearing about someone having, how I used to always hear about it. I mean, back in the day, you know, cancer, like if you had cancer in the 80s, during the 80s decade, you had less they did not have the medicine or technology that could fight off the cancer. Back then, it was common for me to hear that when someone has a cancer that they only have about 9 months, automatically it's only 9 months that they're going to live. That's how it was a common thing I used to hear. But now, if we're talking about cancer today in 2019, well, they have all kinds of, well, anyway, in today's times, when we hear cancer, we hear about radiation treatments and chemo. I don't know, I mean, if they did that. Well, I believe they did that in the 80s, of course. But, I mean, I did not have issues with cancer, or I didn't have anybody in my family who had issues with cancer to know what they did. But I do know that when we hear about cancer today, I don't hear this 9 months thing anymore, like where people used to say that it's an automatic 9 months that you have left to live before. That's how they used to do it back then. That's how they took it back then. But, you know, back then in the 80s, during the 80s, I mean, they had less available medicine or less available ability to fight off these diseases. And I don't know, like on this video, I'm only going to talk about cancer and AIDS and HIV because, I mean, those are the two things that I know off the bat has changed a little bit. I mean, you guys can chime in on what else has changed over the years, but for today anyway, like when we're talking about cancer today, I mean, they have better ability, the medicine and technology, the doctors have better ability to fight it off. But of course, we're still subject to, like, being died or getting killed by this cancer. But anyway, now I'm gonna talk about HIV and AIDS. AIDS. When I first heard about this in the 80s, as far as I can remember. I can remember of hearing about HIV in the middle 80s. But back then, you know, HIV, I mean they had less ability. I mean, I think they had less technology to help fight it off. But I mean, I do know that AIDS or HIV is something that I did not know much about, or that I didn't hear much about back then, because I mean, for me anyway, that's me. I mean, it's like I first heard about AIDS, and I think it started around that time in the 80s or going on to 90s. Like that's the when I started hearing more and more about AIDS, you know, like, because that was kind of like a new one for me going on to the 80s, or it was kind of new, I think. I mean, you guys chime in, but I think it was something kind of new going on to the 80s. So yeah, I mean, it was new, or it was kind of like it was starting to come into this come into the story, you know, AIDS, you know, HIV and AIDS, and then, you know, and then we already know that there's no cure for AIDS. But I mean, back in the time, you know, like they were trying to hopefully find a cure for AIDS by the end of the 90s. Like 1998, I heard it once, you know, one time before. This was in the 80s, you know, but you know, AIDS, I mean, like I know this, what's his name, the singer, Fred Mercury, died from this AIDS in 1991. But I mean, it, like, to hear about AIDS back then in the 80s, that really, I mean, in my time, it was not really in existence to hear about it, to hear about someone with AIDS, because I think it was just mostly colds, or we would think that someone is having a cold or a flu or dying of a flu or something, you know. But I do know, like, and then going on to the 90s, I mean, that's when it seems to me that AIDS like really full bloomed, like being talked about. It reached full bloom that I know of in the 90s, especially like during the times when I was going to the nightclubs and stuff. It's all I would hear about in the 90s. And then, you know, I even had a friend who had HIV and everything, and I knew of several people with HIV in the 90s, but I mean, they all seemed to be living well. I mean, I never really heard of anything bad coming out of AIDS or HIV. I mean, the basic way to survive it, I mean, like, people live pretty much almost the rest of their lives with AIDS or HIV, but they just have to be careful not to get yourself into a situation where I mean, where you're gonna like greatly increase the chances of dying from this complications of HIV and stuff. Like, you got to take care of yourself, things like that, you know. I mean, you got to exercise, whatever. It's the similar thing with the anxiety and stuff, you know. Well, anyway, back in the 80s and 90s, you know, people lived well. I mean, well, I know that the technology, I mean, or the available resources for taking care of AIDS was less. It was less in the 80s. But I mean, going on to the 90s, it started going on full bloom, you know, like where people were really, where the whole world was talking about it and working on it. But now, when we're talking about AIDS today, in 2019, I think it's about the same as far as I know. I mean, people do take their either medicines, or they do the things that they have to do to make the best of their lives. I think it's about the same, but I mean, I just know that in the 80s, it was less pronounced, so to speak, in the 80s. But in the 90s, it was greatly more pronounced. But today, it's all over the world where everybody knows the AIDS thing. Everybody knows AIDS now. But in the 80s, it was not really widely pronounced back then, you know. And that's how I could put it. Well, anyway, so those are the two things, but I could probably add a third thing about comparing 80s with today with medicine and doctors and health and conditions and diseases. Well, one of the things that I could probably point out and maybe shine a little bit on, and that is, you know, anxiety and depression. During the 80s, I mean, it's like in the 80s, I think we had less cases of depression, I would think. I mean, that's just my opinion, though. You guys can chime in here. But I feel like, I mean, I did not really, well, I mean, people were suicidal back then, too. But to me, in my opinion only, I feel like anxiety and depression was a little less back in the 80s and 90s, or more like 80s and before. It was less than it is today, because in the 80s, since we didn't have all the overwhelming things going on here with all the technology, we don't have so many things to have new anxiety about, you know, things that can cause anxiety and stuff, and depression too. I mean, and then not only that, in my town in California, it was less busy, it was less crowded, less busy over here in my town. So it was less busy, so I would think that would contribute to less anxiety and less depression, because we had less people to deal with, you know. This is all my opinion, though. But now today, I feel like today, like versus 1980s, for depression and anxiety, I think we probably have more cases of it today. I think, you know, I mean, I know I had a problem with depression, but of course age has to do with it too. I mean, in my opinion, though, I think depression, anxiety, and then back in the 80s as well, they had fewer choices of medicine for depression and anxiety, or at least that I know of. Back in the 80s, I mean, I think it was less, I mean, they had less things, less resources available to figure out what to do to cure this depression and anxiety, you know, or they had less medicine to choose from, so to speak. If I would know, I mean, that's what I would know of, you know. But anyway, for depression and anxiety, because like they have all kinds of medicines now today, but back then it was less available, or less choices available back then, you know. And of course, you know, maybe one more thing I could probably add to this changes, the 911 system. Well, I think 911 existed in the 80s. It did exist, but I'm not sure when they first came out. Yeah, I'm not really sure when this 911 thing first came out. But I do know, but like before the 80s, you know, we had to use a phone number. We just had to use a phone number. We had to call the police department, right, like directly, or we had to call a hospital or something, you know. If we had a problem, we had to call directly those numbers. But then, you know, that 911 system came out, and I first heard of this 911 system like somewhere around the early 80s, I think, or maybe middle 80s is when I first heard about it. Maybe like a little later, I think in the middle 80s is when I first heard about it, or early 80s, I'm not really sure. But in the 911 system, I mean, but now today, I mean, today, well, I mean, it's what we call them now today. But now, if we're talking about hospitals, what's changed, what I feel has changed over the years, 80s versus today, well, I mean, I think the hospitals are the same, but I mean, still today and yesterday. But I do know that today, in 2019, the ER rooms are busy as hell. I mean, I mean, it's like good luck trying to get care right away over here, because I mean it's like I say, so many people now here compared to what it used to be. The population has grown quite a bit since the 80s, so I mean it's going to be more people, and of course you can imagine more people with anxiety, and that causes all kinds of symptoms, and then it causes everybody to go to the doctor or ER because they're getting symptoms involving this anxiety. Or I mean, that's what I would think, you know. That's just what I would think of it as, you know. But anyway, I mean, there's more. I mean, the ERs are incredibly busy right now, but I don't know how it was during the 80s. I mean, you guys can chime in. I think maybe the 80s, I would say maybe it was a little less busy back then in the ERs. And I think doctors probably, I mean, would promptly get to you right away. But I'm not really sure, because I never really had experiences with having to go to ER, because I never had problems with health or anything, you know. But anyway, I mean, well, I just don't remember experiences in my life, you know, like when when I had an accident as a kid, you know, like when I was climbing up some cabinets and the cabinet fell, and the hutch fell on top of me and caused me to bleed profusely, and it landed me in the hospital. I think my dad was there, and my dad, I don't know how I got to the hospital. I don't know if they called the doctor or the ambulance, or, well, I don't think they had 911 back then, you know. I think my dad probably drove me to a hospital, but I think, I mean, if I remember, I mean, it's like, I mean, that was a kid then. But, and then the accident that I had in my scooter, like when I had the accident and it knocked me out and everything, and I rode an ambulance to the hospital, and they worked on me for 3 days, and I mean, that's my experiences in the 90s. But I mean, that's all that's all I could say about all this. But anyway, the basic thing is cancer and HIV, but the cancer was one of the big things, probably along with a number of other diseases, you know. Like back then they had less ability to cure a disease because the technology wasn't there, and I mean, it wasn't there quite yet to help with these diseases like cancer. They have, you know, like, well, they have sophisticated equipment and technology that helps fight diseases. Like they have that today, so we have better chances of surviving diseases today as compared to the 80s. So I mean, that's what wraps up this video. I'm gonna wrap up this video with that. So I mean, that's my say about what's changed about medicine and doctors and health and everything, and how technology was, or what available resources. Okay, well, I guess I'm gonna wrap this video up. So okay, now just stay tuned for my next video. My next video is gonna be about like what advice I would give you teenagers. One of you, I mean, requested this, so I'm gonna go ahead and make a video about that. And all of you who are like, who lived in the 80s decade, you guys chime in on that video as well. Okay, so this is April 26, 2019, and I hope you liked this video. Alrighty, I'll see y'all.